Very good to have you along. You're watching Roundtable. The money has been pouring in to rebuild Ukraine, with 70% of what's been promised to the United Nations emergency appeal already collected. The US and Europe are the biggest donors, yet some are questioning the West's track record in helping countries post-conflict, citing failures in Afghanistan, Iraq and Somalia. So who should be in charge of rebuilding Ukraine in the long term? Good to have you along. I'm David Foster. At last month's Ukraine Recovery Conference in Switzerland, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said his country's reconstruction is, as he put it, the common task of the entire democratic world. And he laid out a $750 billion recovery plan. As the biggest donor, should the United States take the lead and maybe work with other states to build long-term development programs in health and education, for example? The Ukrainian government has also set up a National Council for the Recovery of Ukraine from the War Advisory Board. Residents in heavily damaged areas of the country, well, they aren't waiting for government assistance, though, and have already started initiatives to rebuild their homes before winter sets in. Let us head first of all to the Algarve in Portugal, where we see Ricardo Leite, a member of Portuguese Parliament. He's a medical doctor trained in infectious diseases who recently went to Ukraine to offer medical assistance and to talk about what else could be offered internationally. We go to Washington, D.C. and say hi to Bill Courtney, Senior Fellow at Rand Corporation Public Policy Think Tank. He is a former U.S. ambassador to Kazakhstan and Georgia and also worked under President Bill Clinton on policy for countries such as Ukraine and others in that region. Then in Kiev, we welcome Inna Sovsun, Ukrainian MP, former Deputy Minister of Education. And in Berlin, Jessica Berlin, visiting fellow at the German Marshall Fund. Great to have you all on. Inna, as a member of Parliament, you see things at first hand. You're a resident of Kiev and you understand what the problem is across the whole of the country. What is the scale of it?
Well, the scale is indeed enormous. The modest estimations suggest that we have suffered damages for up to 100 billion US dollars. That is what we have lost because of the Russian missiles, because of the Russian artillery, because of the war going on. We have major damages in infrastructure, of course, that is the biggest one. But then, of course, Ukrainian schools, universities, hospitals, all of that has been severely damaged. Just in education, the sphere that I worked a lot in, we have over 2,000 institutions that have been damaged, and about 300 out of them have been destroyed completely. Those are schools or college or university buildings that are just completely destroyed. In the whole Luhansk region, we do not have a single hospital or any medical facility that was not damaged one way or another, and majority of them are just completely destroyed. And then, of course, the basic infrastructure like roads, bridges, they all have been destroyed to a very big extent. I myself, when I have to travel to my parents who live 50 kilometers away from Kyiv, I have to take a route that is a bit different from my typical route because the bridge that I typically took to travel to my parents is completely destroyed.
When it comes to education, and you talk about 300 institutions completely destroyed and over 2,000 total damaged, what are the young people, whether they're school children or university children, what are they doing right now for education?
Well, right now they are on vacation, so that gave us a little bit of time to prepare for the next school year, which is to start on September 1st. But right now there is some work done to at least fix the buildings that are fixable in a short amount of time. But truth be told, the major effort is being put now not so much as to restore the buildings that have been damaged or destroyed, but to create shelters, bomb shelters in the schools that will open to an extent where that it would be possible, so that we can start the school year and pupils can go to school offline. And that is the biggest thing that we are working on in terms of education.
And that's the beginning of next month. Ricardo, you'll tell me when you were there, but it is fairly recently. Talking of bomb shelters, you went down into this hospital in Lviv when the air raid sirens or warnings sounded, and they have to treat people and take patients down into the underground part of the hospital. As we look at the pictures, as you walk through there, as we see the stills of the very small children, tell us what you discovered when you went in.
Well, thanks, David. It's great to be among my esteemed colleagues. And to say that I just came back from Lviv about a couple of weeks ago, where I was volunteering at the regional clinical hospital, where, for example, the neonatal intensive care unit, so for newborn babies, many of which are premature, has been permanently in the underground bunker since March this year because, as you can imagine, we cannot transport incubators from the first or second levels of the hospital to underground every time the alarms go off. So these healthcare workers that have been working throughout the pandemic with very dire conditions, now for 6 months have been working underground with no natural light. I mean, my T-shirt was glued to my body 1 hour after being underground with them, looking at these newborn babies. And so you can understand how intensely difficult this can be for everyone in the staff. But I have to say that across the board, I have only found passionate healthcare workers, doctors, nurses, pharmacists. Everyone is very engaged in doing their part in this collective effort. They believe that they are doing their part in terms of the war effort to free Ukraine from its invaders.
I understand, and I believe you spoke with the health minister. What advice did you offer him, and in particular, really, what did he ask the international community was most needed?
Well, I was in Ukraine, also part of a mission with the Association of Ukrainians Living in Portugal, where we're fundraising actually for a new maternity in Lviv, and I wanted to present that to the minister. But we spoke more broadly on the enormous impact that having Ukraine become a candidate country to the European Union, how this opens doors to potential funding, for example, not only for the reconstruction of critical infrastructure, also in terms of their health system, but even in terms of immediate needs. And one of the things that the Minister of Health, Victor Liasco, asked me directly was to try to galvanize support from European member states to welcome civilians and soldiers that have been mutilated due to their time in the war front. The country is not capable of providing prosthetic limbs, arms, legs, and medical rehabilitation for so many people who need it right now. And as the war goes on, more and more needs will come about. And so this is just one small aspect of the impact of war. The other aspect is, of course, in my case, having been in Lviv, we talked about how the evacuation trains coming out from the front of the war are taking hundreds of thousands of people to the western part of the country, which of course now has many more people living there. Thus, the health system is overloaded in a way.
Okay, I want to bring in Bill at this particular point, and it's a very short question. Since you've been involved in this region on and off for the last 30 years or so, and you've seen similar situations, although not as severe, in Georgia, for example, with something as big as this, where do you start?
Well, it's useful to take a look at the reconstruction activity in the 1990s in the Balkans after the wars which led to the breakup of former Yugoslavia. There were three main elements to that reconstruction. One was providing security for it. In that case, NATO military presence was on the ground to do that. In the case of Ukraine, most likely that won't be the case. Ukraine's military is strong itself, but of course it would receive supplies from NATO countries. The second part of the Balkans reconstruction was economic reform and taking the Balkan countries closer to European Union. That is very analogous to the Ukrainian situation. There needs to be more reform. There needs to be anti-corruption anti-monopolization, pro-competition, privatization, and there needs to be really an effort by the European Union to bring Ukraine closer to the European Union faster with greater access to the single market.
Bill, while you're talking, I'm going to bring in the Ukrainian Prime Minister, who will reinforce the point that you've just made.
We should create conditions when corruption will be impossible. So first of all is digitalization. So we digitalized many spheres in our country. First of all, investment sphere, constructing and architectural sphere. It's absolutely developed and digitalized, and it's make corruption in this sphere impossible. And many investors approved this before the war. Next steps, now we are working on the digitalization of all other spheres, beginning from the custom.
It appears that they already have an idea, the Ukrainian government as it stands at the moment, of modernizing, if you like, the society, getting rid of corruption. But I suppose an awful lot of this can't happen until the conflict is over, because if you talk about security needed to make sure that the projects can get underway, if there's still shelling, if there's still bombardment, that's going to be pretty much impossible, isn't it?
It's not impossible. Some progress could be made while the conflict is underway, but much of it will have to wait until after the conflict. And then the third part of the Balkans experience was physical reconstruction. As mentioned by our colleague, $100 billion might be a reasonable estimate for physical reconstruction. There, the Ukrainians themselves will have to do a lot in terms of business leaders rebuilding their businesses, people fixing up their apartments and houses after destruction. But the European Union will likely, as with the Balkans, take the financial lead in the West in helping Ukraine do the physical reconstruction. So we're really talking about three things now: security, economic reform, and refugee return, and physical reconstruction. The problem has to be addressed in that holistic dimension.
Okay, I'm going to come to you in just a moment, because I know you have thoughts about who should pay the bills when it comes to the reconstruction. But Jessica, you first of all, you're going back from Berlin to Kiev, I think next week, one of a number of trips that you've made. What do you think the view is in Ukraine about where the money should come from and who should provide it and the lead in all of this? Should it be the Ukrainians? Should it be the international community? What do they think?
Already there have been several meetings at high level between EU and US leaders on how to finance Ukraine's reconstruction. But let's be very clear, what the point you raised before, there can be no long-term reconstruction effort until the war is won. This is and must be the highest priority, not only from the clear, obvious moral implication to save lives and to end this illegal invasion as soon as possible, but also from the perspective of the donor nations who will be co-financing Ukraine's reconstruction. They should be very aware that for every day that passes, this is increasing the bill that they will be footing for reconstruction. So for any Western politicians who are concerned about the war, concerned about the bill, but are hesitating on investing now in the military equipment and supplies that Ukraine needs to decisively and swiftly win this war, they should be reminded that to invest now and enable the Ukrainian military to end the war and end the invasion will be the first and best investment in then being able to rebuild the country.
So as quick as possible, and the longer you delay, then the more difficult it becomes. But the real point that I'm trying to drive at here, and thank you very much for those thoughts, the real point I'm trying to drive at here is who actually provides the money? Should it come from the Ukrainians? Should it come from the European Union? Should it come from the Russians? And if the money comes from one particular group, do they have a vested interest then? Do they have skin in the game, as people put it?
We have to be realistic here. It's not going to come from a single source. This is going to be a global reconstruction effort. Like I already mentioned, the EU and the US are already engaged in discussions on this. There's going to be another summit later this fall at a very technocratic level discussing how to structure the reconstruction fund. Also, Japan and South Korea are involved in these discussions. This will be a multi-party effort. And in terms of Russia, there have also already been discussions around how to convert seized Russian assets into money for Ukraine's reconstruction. So to answer your question, all of the above, these are all resources that will be taken into play. And of course, the hard work of the Ukrainian people will be a huge driver of reconstruction, just as we saw after World War II. At the end of the day, it is uncountable hours of labor of every man and woman across Western Europe, and who were clearing the rubble and rebuilding after World War II. And I fear a lot of this will also be required in Ukraine, but also Ukrainian industry and the military, as you mentioned. This will be a team effort, and it is possible. And also there can be opening up of climate funds to enable greenification of Ukrainian infrastructure. There are literal billions in climate financing available around the world.
In a sense, Ukraine could come out of this as a modernized country in the same way that a Germany that had been battered at the end of the Second World War was able to do, and lead a massive economic recovery. Your thoughts on that in just a moment. Inna, I believe you think that Russia should be made to pay financially as well as perhaps morally in this case. But isn't there a danger, referring to an earlier conflict than the Second World War, that rather like after the 1914-18 conflict, the losers in this war, if it happens to be Russia, are punished so hard that their attitude towards conflict in the future becomes much harder? And we saw what happened with Germany in 1936 or 1933 onwards. You can't be too hard on Russia. You can't make them pay the entire bill, otherwise they will be completely and utterly subjugated and soured.
Well, I would agree with what Jessica said, that apparently the bill would have to be split between different actors. And of course, Ukrainian society is already paying very, very hardly for this. We very much hope for our allies to pitch in, to help in the recovery effort. And again, they're doing a lot already. But of course, this is an ongoing process, and there will be bigger needs. But Russia needs to pay as well. Because yes, indeed, the conditions after the First World War led to the Second World War. But also remember that after all, Germany was actually paying reparations after the World War II. And that is what Russia needs to be doing as well. It has destroyed Ukrainian economy. It has destroyed Ukrainian infrastructure. They cannot just be let go. You know, we cannot just go back to business as usual. So no, we do not.
What I'm saying is it can't be too severe, because if there hadn't been a Second World War, the reparations that Germany was forced to pay after 1918 would have lasted until 1965. I mean, decades and decades and decades. You've got to be careful where you go with one of these things. Thank you for that, Ricardo. I'm going to come to you, and then to you, Bill. Yes, please.
Just
please.
One comment.
Yeah,
one comment. Truth be told, what I do care about is not what Russia will be doing. Of course, we understand that this will be affecting Ukraine. But what I want to see is Ukraine coming out of this terrible, terrifying war as a stronger, more modernized economy, more democratic society. And I believe that we should try to take a more positive outlook as an opportunity to build a society, not to reconstruct what we had before, but actually to build better, more fair, more just, more developed society.
And that is indeed, I'm going to stop you just for a second. That is indeed what your president said at the time of the Ukraine Rebuilding Conference.
The reconstruction of our state is not only rebuilding the walls destroyed by bombardments. Ukraine must become the freest, most modern and safest country in Europe.
Ricardo, I want you to talk, if you can, about, as a medical doctor, what problems you saw then that need to be addressed. Mental health, depression, anxiety, PTSD, terrible wounds caused by the bombardments, etc., etc. Where's the number one priority there?
Well, I have to say that the priorities are across the board. We're talking about Ukraine, which had a health system before the war that in many aspects was already ailing, was not having access to, let's say, first-line technologies in all fields. And of course, with the war, with the displacement of people within the country, with the bombing of critical infrastructures, with the difficulties of importing goods, we are seeing a huge rise of needs, even dealing with common chronic conditions like hypertension and diabetes. But you're right, mental health is a huge issue. I worked closely with clinical psychologists that were around the clock taking calls from civilians and soldiers, and especially in the more affected areas of the country, asking for help because we are seeing tremendous rise of depression, of anxiety. Yes, post-traumatic stress disorder is more and more present, and it is affecting the country in a way that will be present for many years to come, even after the war ends, which doesn't seem to be anywhere in sight.
Okay. So I'm going to have to. Time is an enemy for us, and I feel very rude moving it on and on. But Bill, I want to come to you. As a diplomat, as a member of the U.S. diplomatic corps, you will have had to study as a younger man the pluses and minuses of statecraft when it came to the Marshall Plan implemented, I think, in about 1947 for the rebuilding of Europe. What lessons can those looking at doing the same for Ukraine learn, both in terms of mistakes not to make and the successes and the reasons, the things they need to follow?
Well, a couple of interesting things about the Marshall Plan. First, the United States asked the European countries, the West European countries, to come up with a plan for reconstruction. So there was a lot of local empowerment. The United States did not tell them how to reconstruct their countries. That helped make it successful. Second, the Marshall Plan had a huge psychological impact, but the economic impact was less than some people might think. It was always less than 5% of the gross domestic product of the West European economies. So most of the effort, the largest part of the effort, was by the Europeans themselves. And then third, in the Marshall Plan, there wasn't much emphasis on reform. But now we understand a lot more about how economies work. And so with regard to Ukraine, there'll be much more interest in improving the functioning of the economy through economic reform rather than wasting assistance monies, for example, on inefficient state enterprises.
Okay, Jessica, you were nodding your head.
Yes, yeah, precisely as he said, the majority of the work was done by the people of Europe themselves in reconstruction. And in the same way, when Ukraine rebuilds, it will be rebuilt by Ukrainians with the support of the international community. But make no mistake, this is not some sort of charity project that the Western world will be doing for Ukraine. This will be work we do together because Ukraine's security and prosperity is also European security and prosperity. So for every penny we invest in Ukraine, we are investing in ourselves as well.
There is a danger, and this is, I'm sorry to butt in, there is a danger that however much you may think you're getting money that you don't have to account for in so many ways, countries are often beholden to those who do give them these funds. I take United Kingdom with the Marshall Plan and the intervention of the Americans in 1941. They were made effectively to give up their colonies as a condition for receiving this help. Is there any concern in Ukraine that there could be leverage extracted out of this in certain ways?
Well, I myself do not see danger in that, but I believe there are some forces inside Ukraine who are concerned. People who are, as Bill mentioned, living through corruption chains in the state enterprises, for instance. Of course, they are concerned. So I believe that the leverage that the West and other countries that will get engaged are getting is the one to help make Ukraine better. So those who are, from the past, from the corrupt system, they are of course concerned. But me, I'm actually happy about bringing in the Western ideas and more procedures, policies, and all of that from the European Union. And I believe that will be to the benefit of Ukraine altogether.
Okay, let's hope that isn't naivety and that is well-placed trust. Thank you for that, Ina. Ricardo, as we take another look at the pictures you shot in Kiev fairly recently, I want you to tell me not just about, well, rather not what you think needs to happen long term, but with patients such as this and conditions such as this, what can be done immediately? What can anybody outside think they could do to help those we're seeing in these shots?
Well, we have to look at the short term, but also the long term investment that we need to make in Ukraine. Has been mentioned, and Jessica has stressed how the Ukrainians are truly fighting the war for the freedom of all Europeans, and thus there is an obligation from our part as European members to do our part. Immediately, as I mentioned, there is a need in terms of responding to the consequences of the war in terms of physical rehabilitation, of providing all of the technologies that the country does not have helping rebuild hospitals and clinics that have been bombed, ensuring that we are capable of providing care in parts of the country where there is no or very little humanitarian assistance, because all of the humanitarian assistance is being vacuumed to the front of the war. There are other parts of the country that are taking in so many millions of displaced people internally that only depend on the healthcare workers that are on the ground. In the long term, we need to look at the kind of investments that need to be made to leapfrog some of the problems that Western health systems have been confronting, so that Ukraine can come out, as you were saying, David, as a modernized country, also when it comes to healthcare, so that Ukrainians will want to go back to their country and have the kind of care that is needed, because without a strategy that focuses on health and well-being, it will be impossible for the people to rebuild the country after the war.
Rebuilding not just financially, but also in terms of society. Listen, thank you for all of your thoughts and your ideas, and good luck in Ukraine for the future. Thanks for coming on the programme. And thank you, wherever you're watching this edition of Roundtable. We appreciate the fact that you take the time and have the patience to do so. And we hope you will continue in that vein. From me, David Foster, and the Roundtable team. Until next time, bye-bye.